The sky above the moon of Xylos was not black, but a bruised and violent purple, scarred by the nebulas that bled across the edge of the sector. Kyle gripped the control yoke of the Iron Vulture, his knuckles white against the worn leather, fighting to keep the ship from tearing itself apart in the upper atmosphere. The alarms were not beeping, they were screaming, a singular, continuous tone that vibrated in his teeth. He had flown through blockade runners' fire and navigated asteroid fields that would shred a cruiser. But this was different. This was an electromagnetic pulse anomaly, a ghost in the machine that had seized his engines and turned his sleek transport into a falling brick. He had been hired for 50,000 credits. It was the kind of money that allowed a man to vanish, to buy a small patch of terraformed land on a rim world and never touch a blaster again. The client, a cloaked broker with a voice like grinding stones, had called it a simple retrieval. Go to Xylos, enter the ruins of the sunken palace, retrieve the royal relic, do not ask questions. Kale had not asked questions. In his line of work, curiosity was the quickest route to a shallow grave. But as the ground rushed up to meet him, a landscape of jagged gray rock and craters the size of cities, he regretted not asking at least one question about the atmospheric stability of this forsaken rock. The impact was less of a crash and more of a controlled collision. The landing struts sheared off with the scream of tearing metal, and the hull groaned as it skidded across the basalt plains, carving a trench 300 yards long before coming to a halt against a ridge of obsidian. Silence followed. It was absolute and suffocating. Kale exhaled, a long breath that fogged in the cooling air of the cockpit. He checked his limbs, bruised ribs, a ringing in his left ear, and a deep gash on his forehead that was already dripping blood into his eye. But he was alive. He unbuckled the harness and grabbed his rifle from the rack. It was a kinetic repeater, heavy and reliable, a weapon designed for stopping power rather than finesse. He kicked the emergency release of the hatch, and it blew outward with a hiss of hydraulic pressure. The air on Xylos was breathable but thin, tasting of ozone and ancient dust. Kale stepped out onto the hull of his ruined ship and looked toward the horizon. The ruins of the sunken palace lay 5 miles to the east, a skeletal silhouette against the bruising sky. It was a remnant of the Galaxis Civil War, a conflict that had ended 10 years ago but had left scars across a dozen systems. Xylos had been a stronghold of the old monarchy, the royal family that had been purged by the United Terra Alliance. Now, it was a graveyard. Kale began the trek. The gravity was lighter here, allowing him to cover ground with loping strides. But the terrain was treacherous. Every step kicked up clouds of gray ash that coated his boots and clung to his coat. As he walked, he saw the debris of the war. Rusted hulks of walkers lay half-buried in the drifts. Helmets of dead soldiers, both human and alien, stared up at the nebula with hollow visors. It was a place where ghosts lingered, and Kyle, a man who usually did not believe in anything he could not shoot, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He reached the perimeter of the palace hours later. The structure was colossal, built from a shimmering iridescent stone that seemed to absorb the ambient light. Towers that had once pierced the sky were now broken stumps, and the grand archway of the entrance was clogged with fallen masonry. Kyle activated the flashlight mounted on his shoulder and climbed over a slab of marble the size of a hover tank. Inside, the silence was heavier. The air was still, undisturbed for a decade. He moved through a grand hall where statues of the alien royalty stood in varied states of disrepair. They were tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and high cheekbones, their stone eyes watching him with imperious judgment. Kyle ignored them, checking the tracking fob in his hand. The signal was strong, The relic was close. He moved deeper into the complex, his boots echoing on the mosaic floor. The tracking fob led him toward what looked like a throne room, a vast chamber dominated by a crystalline seat at the far end. But as he stepped through the doorway, he stopped. He was not alone. Standing near the throne was a figure. At first, Kyle thought it was another statue. So perfectly still did it stand. But then the figure turned, and the light from his shoulder lamp caught the gleam of violet eyes. It was a woman. She was alien, clearly of the species that had built this place. She was tall, taller than him by a few inches, with skin that seemed to hold a faint inner luminescence, like moonlight trapped in porcelain. She wore armor, but it was unlike anything Kale had seen on the battlefield. It was ceremonial, plates of silver and white gold intricately etched with flowing script, worn over a bodysuit of deep indigo. A ragged cloak hung from her shoulders, dusty and torn, the only sign that she had been living in this wasteland. Kyle raised his rifle instantly, the movement a reflex born of a lifetime of violence. The woman did not flinch. She held a staff in her hand, a weapon of ancient design with a bifurcated tip that hummed with unstable energy. She looked at him, and her expression was unreadable. It was not fear, and it was not anger. It was a profound ancient sorrow. "Leave," she said. Her voice was melodious, vibrating in the air like a plucked string. But the common tongue was accented, archaic. Kale kept his aim steady, centered on her chest. "I have a job to do. Step aside." "This is a place of the dead," she said, taking a slow step forward. "You do not belong here, mercenary. There is nothing for you but dust and echoes." Kale narrowed his eyes. The tracking fob was screaming now. The relic was right behind her, likely on the throne itself. But as he looked at her, a strange sensation washed over him. It was a prickle at the base of his neck, a sudden vertigo-inducing sense of familiarity. He knew the curve of her jaw. He knew the way she held her head, chin slightly lifted in defiance. He blinked, trying to clear the dust from his vision. He had never been to Xylos. He had never met a royal alien. He was a kid from the slums of Earth Sector 4 who had joined the Corps to avoid starvation. Yet, looking at her felt like remembering a song he had not heard in 20 years. "Who are you?" Kyle asked, his voice rougher than he intended. She paused. For a second, the stoic mask she wore slipped. Her violet eyes searched his face, scanning his scars, the gray in his stubble, the hardness in his gaze. Her lips parted slightly, and he saw a tremor in her hand where she gripped the staff. "You truly do not know," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a realization that seemed to drain the light from her skin. "I asked you a question," Kyle barked, the familiarity making him angry now. It felt like a trick, a psychic projection used by some of the older races. "I am the guardian of this grave," she said, her voice hardening again, the mask slipping back into place. "And you are trespassing." She moved then, faster than a human could track. Kyle squeezed the trigger, but she was already gone. She sidestepped the burst of kinetic fire and closed the distance between them in a blur of motion. She did not strike him with the staff. Instead, she swept his legs with a fluid grace, sending him crashing to the stone floor. The rifle skidded away into the darkness. Kyle scrambled to his feet, drawing the combat knife from his boot, but she was there. She caught his wrist, her grip surprising in its strength. Her skin was cool to the touch, but where her fingers met his flesh, a jolt of electricity arced between them. It wasn't painful. It was magnetic. Kyle gasped, freezing. The woman froze too. She looked down at where their skin touched, her eyes widening. The energy between them pulsed, a rhythmic beat that matched the thudding of Kale's heart. You are hurt, she said softly. Kale pulled his arm back, breathing hard. He had forgotten the gash on his forehead. The adrenaline had masked the pain, but now he felt the blood running down his cheek, blinding him in one eye. It is nothing, he grunted, backing away to retrieve his rifle. She did not stop him. She simply watched him, and he saw moisture gathering in the corners of her violet eyes. She blinked it away instantly, turning her face to the shadows. Sit, she commanded. Kale scoffed, checking the charge on his rifle. I am not here to play nursemaid with a ghost. Hand over the relic, and I will leave. There is no relic, she said, turning back to him. There is only the past. And if you do not stop that bleeding, you will faint before you reach your ship. Kale hesitated. He was dizzy. The crash had rattled him more than he wanted to admit. He looked at the woman, at the strange mix of regality and vulnerability in her stance. If she wanted him dead, she could have killed him when he was on the ground. He sat on the steps of the dais, keeping the rifle across his knees. And try anything, and I will burn this whole palace down. She knelt before him, up close. She was breathtaking. Her features were sharp, alien, yet undeniably beautiful. She smelled of rain and ozone. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the wound on his forehead. This will sting, she murmured. She placed her palm against his skin. Kale grit his teeth, expecting the burn of a cauterizer or the sting of a chemical spray. Instead, he felt a rush of pure liquid heat. It wasn't just physical. It felt as if she was pouring something of herself into him. His vision whitened for a second. He felt a sensation of rushing water, of wind through high grass, of a small hand gripping his. His body trembled. He looked at her and saw that she was trembling too. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in concentration. The connection between them was terrifyingly intimate, far more intimate than the act of healing a wound should be. It felt like a conversation spoken in a language he did not speak but somehow understood. He felt something stir in the locked basement of his mind. A shadow, a shape. Then she pulled away. The pain was gone. Kyle reached up and touched his forehead. The skin was smooth, and there was not even a scar. He stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. What did you do? I repaired the damage, she said, her voice breathless. She stood up quickly, putting distance between them as if she had been burned. She smoothed her ceremonial armor, refusing to look him in the eye. That was not just first aid, Kale said, standing up. The dizziness was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness. Who are you? Why do you feel like I should know you? She turned away, her shoulders stiff. You are mistaken. Humans often confuse bioresonance for familiarity. It is a side effect of the healing. Liar, Kale thought, but before he could speak, a high-pitched whine cut through the silence of the throne room. Ceressa spun around, her staff igniting with a crackle of purple energy. Kale recognized the sound instantly. It was the sound of death. Drones, he hissed, bringing his rifle up. From the high vaulted ceiling, dark shapes descended. They were arachnid-like machines, black chrome and red sensors, skittering down the pillars with mechanical precision. Hunter-killers, imperial tech. They weren't scavengers. They were military grade. How did they find us? Kale yelled. Opening fire! The roar of the kinetic repeater shattered the ancient quiet. They are not here for you, she shouted back. She swung her staff, launching a bolt of plasma that vaporized the lead drone. They are here for me. More drones poured in through the shattered windows, and there were dozens of them. The air filled with the acrid smell of ozone and burning metal. Kale dropped one, then another, but they were fast, moving with hive-mind coordination. "We cannot hold them here," Kyle shouted over the noise of the firefight. "The catacombs," she commanded, pointing to a hidden panel behind the throne. "We must go to the core." "I am not going anywhere with you," Kyle argued, blasting a drone that had leaped toward her. "Do you want to die, human?" she snapped, her eyes blazing with a ferocity that made him step back. "Or do you want to live?" Kale cursed, firing a suppression burst that swept the front line of the swarm. He grabbed a grenade from his belt and hurled it into the center of the room. "Move!" They ran. The grenade detonated with a concussive thump that shook dust from the ceiling. Ceressa slammed her palm against the hidden panel, and a section of the wall slid open. They dove inside just as the room behind them was bathed in laser fire. The panel slid shut, plunging them into darkness. "Light," Ceressa whispered, and the tip of her staff glowed, casting a soft violet illumination over the tunnel. It was narrow, the walls lined with conduits and pipes that pulsed with a faint, dormant rhythm. They ran in silence, the sounds of the drones scratching at the stone behind them fading as they went deeper. Kale followed her, watching the way she moved. She knew these tunnels. She moved through them not like a soldier, but like someone who had played in them as a child. They descended for what felt like miles. The air grew warmer, humming with a vibration that Kale could feel in the soles of his boots. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast spherical chamber. It was the star drive core. In the center of the room, suspended over a bottomless chasm, was a massive crystal structure, rotating slowly. It was dead, dark, but the residual energy was enough to make the hair on Kale's arms stand up. Walkways spanned the emptiness. Spiderwebs of metal connecting the core to the control platforms. They stopped on one of the platforms, breathing hard. Kale leaned against the railing, checking his ammo counter. He was low. "We are safe here," Ceressa said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "The radiation from the core disrupts their sensors. They cannot track us." Kale holstered his rifle and looked at her. In the violet light of the core, she looked like a ghost queen. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, leaving the strange tension between them exposed again. "You are a high-value target for a dead empire," Kale said. "Hunter-killers don't chase scrap dealers. You are royalty." "I am nothing," she said, looking out at the dark crystal. "I am a relic, just like the one you came to steal." "You knew I was coming," Kale said, stepping closer. "You weren't surprised when you saw me. You were disappointed." She stiffened, not disappointed. "Then what?" She turned to face him. The sorrow was back, raw and unguarded. She looked at his face, searching it desperately, looking for something he did not know how to give her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid words. "Don't you remember me?" "Human?" she whispered. The question hung in the air. Kale stared at her. He wanted to say yes. Every instinct in his body was screaming that he knew her. He felt the phantom memory of her hand in his, of a voice laughing, of a promise made in the dark. But his mind was a blank slate. He rifled through his memories, the orphanage, the street gangs, the military academy, the mercenary work. She was in none of them. He felt a spike of irritation at his own confusion, and he buried it under the cold armor of his profession. "No," he said flatly. "I have never seen you before in my life." Ceressa flinched as if he had struck her. She took a breath, a shuddering inhale, and turned her face away to hide the tears that spilled over. "Of course," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you?" Suddenly, Kyle's head snapped back. A flash of white-hot pain seared behind his eyes. "Vision? He is small, a boy of 7 or 8. He is wearing a white hospital gown. He is standing in a sterile white room, pressing his hands against a thick pane of glass. On the other side is a girl. She has violet eyes and skin that glows faintly. She is crying. She presses her hand against the glass, matching his. Her fingers are long, alien, beautiful. He feels a surge of protectiveness so strong it nearly chokes him. "Don't cry," he mouths to her through the glass. "I am right here." The girl looks up and tries to smile. "End vision." Kyle gasped, stumbling back against the railing. He rubbed his eyes, his heart racing. "What is it?" Saressa asked, alarmed by his sudden movement. Kyle looked at her. The image of the girl in the glass overlapped with the woman standing before him. But it made no sense. He had never been a test subject. He had never been in a white room like that. It was a hallucination, a side effect of the crash or the weird radiation in this core. Nothing. Kale lied, his voice rasping. Just a headache. Saressa looked at him, her gaze piercing, but she did not press him. She seemed exhausted, the weight of the encounter draining the ethereal energy from her. "We must rest," she said softly. "The drones will search the upper levels for hours. We are safe here for the night." She sat down on the metal grating of the platform, pulling her tattered cloak around her. She did not invite him to sit with her. She curled up, facing away from him, making herself small. Kale sat down a few feet away. He placed his rifle between them. He leaned back against a support strut, watching her back. He could see the subtle rise and fall of her shoulders. She was crying. She was doing it silently, with the practice of someone who had learned to hide her pain a long time ago. He wanted to reach out. The urge to touch her shoulder, to comfort her, was a physical ache in his chest. But he didn't. He didn't know her. He was a mercenary, and she was a target, and the galaxy was a cruel place that did not reward kindness. He closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the core. Eventually, exhaustion took him. He slept back to back with the alien princess, separated by 2 feet of cold metal and a lifetime of forgotten memories. In the dark, Kyle dreamed. He dreamed he was drowning in a sea of stars. He couldn't breathe, but he wasn't afraid. A voice was calling to him from the surface. It was a girl's voice, speaking a language he did not understand, yet the sound of it was the most important thing in the universe. 9, the voice called. Subject 9. Come back to me. Kale reached up through the water, his hand breaking the surface, grasping for fingers that were just out of reach. He strained, pushing against the weight of the ocean, screaming a name he did not know he knew. And in the silence of the ancient core, while Kale tossed in his sleep, Saressa lay awake, staring into the darkness, remembering the boy who had once promised he would never forget her. The ascent from the core of the ancient star drive took hours, a silent climb through the vertebrae of a dead leviathan. Kale and Saressa moved through maintenance shafts that smelled of stagnant oil and decay, the only light coming from the faint violet pulse of her staff. They emerged not into the open air of the moon, but into the docking ring of a hidden orbital tether, a relic of the rebel alliance that had been abandoned when the war turned against them. The station was a ghost town of durasteel and vacuum-sealed glass, floating in the debris field above Xylos. Gravity here was artificial and flickering, creating a nauseating sensation of weightlessness that would vanish in a heartbeat. Slamming their boots back to the deck plates, Kale checked the charge on his rifle. It was dangerously low. He looked at the woman standing by the viewport, staring out at the bruised purple nebula. She had not spoken since the core. The vulnerability she had shown in the dark was gone, replaced by that imperious mask of ceramic calm. "You said you had a ship," Kale said, his voice echoing in the empty observation deck. "I said I had a way off this rock," Ceressa corrected without turning around. "There is a shuttle in Bay 4. It is old, but it will fly." Kale walked up behind her. He stopped a few feet away, studying the rigid line of her spine. The way she held herself was not just military, it was aristocratic. It was the posture of someone who expected the universe to rearrange itself around her. "Who are you really?" Kale asked. "You are no scavenger. You have royal codes. You wield energy like a sorceress, and you have the eyes of the ruling caste." Ceressa turned slowly. The starlight caught the sharp angles of her face. "I am Ceressa of Valian," she said, the words heavy with a formal cadence. "Fourth scion of the eternal throne, daughter of the Empress who burned half this galaxy to keep her crown." Kale stared at her, then let out a short, dry laugh. He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck where the tension was knotting the muscle. "Right," he said. "And I am the Emperor himself. Look, lady." The Valian line was wiped out. The Terra Alliance glassed the capital city 10 years ago. There were no survivors. "They missed one," Ceressa said softly. Kyle looked for the lie in her eyes, but he found only a terrifying, hollow truth. She believed it, and looking at the intricate, glowing markings on her skin, the way the ancient tech of the palace had responded to her touch, Kale felt a cold stone of dread settle in his stomach. If she was who she said she was the most valuable bounty in existence. The Alliance would pay millions for her head. The Imperial loyalists would pay billions. "And I suppose you hid in a hole for a decade?" Kale asked, skepticism still edging his voice. "I was hidden," she said, her gaze drifting past him, buried, erased, until I heard a rumor that a mercenary was coming for a relic that did not exist. She looked at him then, and the intensity of her violet eyes made Kale step back. "I came out of the dark for you. Human." Kale opened his mouth to respond, to demand what she meant, but the station's proximity alarm screamed. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic klaxon that bathed the deck in washing red light. Kyle spun around, rushing to the console. His fingers flew over the dusty interface. "We have company," he growled. 3 signatures, fast movers, Imperial scout interceptors. "They are docking at the upper pylon." "They found us," Ceressa said. She did not sound surprised. She sounded resigned. Kale grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the viewport. "We are leaving. Now." They sprinted toward the hangar bays. The station groaned around them, the ancient metal protesting the sudden shifts in pressure as the Imperial ships latched onto the hull. Kale could hear the hiss of cutting torches somewhere above them, the sound of the station being breached. They reached the main concourse, a wide promenade lined with empty shops and ticket counters. It was the only path to the shuttles. As they ran, the gravity generator failed completely. The world tilted. Kale's stomach lurched into his throat as his feet left the floor. He grabbed a railing, floating in the sudden zero gravity. Debris, dust, old papers, loose bolts began to drift around them like a snow globe shaken by a giant hand. "Move!" Kale shouted, kicking off the wall to propel himself forward. Ceressa floated beside him, her movements graceful and fluid, as if she were swimming underwater. She used her staff to push off the ceiling, gliding with a terrifying elegance. At the far end of the concourse, the airlock doors hissed open. 3 figures in black void armor floated through. They were Imperial assassins, faceless behind mirrored visors, mag boots locking onto the floating debris to stabilize them. They raised suppressed carbines. Kyle fired first. The recoil of his kinetic rifle in zero gravity sent him spinning backward. His shot went wide, sparking against the bulkhead. The assassins returned fire, silent streaks of plasma burning the air around them. Kale grabbed Ceresa's cloak and yanked her behind a floating kiosk. Plasma bolts chewed through the metal of their cover, sending molten droplets floating through the air like deadly fireflies. "We are pinned!" Kale yelled, trying to stabilize himself against the kiosk. "We need to get past them," Ceresa said. Her eyes were scanning the room, calculating. "There are 3 of them and 1 of them," Kale snapped, "and my gun is running on fumes." "Wait," Ceresa whispered. She looked at the assassins. They were pausing, their helmet lights sweeping the room. They were scanning for biosignatures. They are looking for a specific heat pattern, a royal signature. "And you are lighting up their scopes like a flare," Kale said. Ceresa looked at him. Her expression shifted, a sudden desperate resolve hardening her features. "Mask me," she said. "What?" "Hide my signature. Merge it with yours." Kyle didn't have time to ask how. The assassins were pushing off the wall, drifting toward their position. Ceresa grabbed the lapels of his jacket and pulled him close, her legs wrapped around his waist, anchoring them together in the weightlessness. She didn't hesitate. She smashed her lips against his. It was not a kiss of romance. It was a tactical collision. But the moment their mouths met, the tactic dissolved into something else entirely. Kale froze. A shockwave went through him, hotter and faster than a blaster bolt. It was the same energy he had felt when she healed him, but amplified. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, frantic and bird-like. He could taste the desperation on her tongue. The universe narrowed down to the sensation of her body pressed against his, the smell of ozone and rain, the softness of her lips moving against his rougher ones. His hands, acting on an instinct he didn't understand, came up to cup her face, his fingers tangling in her hair. He deepened the kiss, groaning into her mouth. The electric hum of her skin seemed to bleed into his, blurring the lines of where he ended and she began. It was terrifying. It was familiar. It felt like coming home. For a moment, the assassins, the war, the dying station, it all ceased to exist. There was only this breathless, impossible connection in the dark. A plasma bolt struck the kiosk inches from Kale's head, showering them in sparks. The reality of their situation came rushing back. Kale broke the kiss, gasping for air. He looked at Ceresa. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dilated, her lips swollen and red. She looked as shaken as he felt. The assassins were confused. The bioscan had merged 2 signatures into one chaotic blur, delaying their targeting algorithms just enough. "Go!" Kale roared. He shoved away from the kiosk, raising his rifle. He didn't aim. He simply unloaded the last of his magazine in a spray of suppression fire. The assassins scattered, their formation breaking as they dodged the kinetic rounds. Ceresa didn't waste the opening. She pointed her staff at the floor panel beneath the assassins and unleashed a pulse of violet energy. The panel exploded, venting the atmosphere from the maintenance sublevel. The sudden vacuum sucked the assassins down, tumbling them into the dark bowels of the station. Kale grabbed Ceresa's hand. They kicked off the wall, flying through the open air toward the shuttle bay. They slammed the airlock door shut behind them and collapsed onto the deck of the bay just as the gravity generator kicked back on, slamming them to the floor. They lay there for a moment, panting, chests heaving. Kale looked at her. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her lips. His blood was singing, a high, thin note of adrenaline and something else, something heavy and aching. Ceresa stared at the ceiling, refusing to look at him. She touched her lips with trembling fingers, then quickly dropped her hand. Neither of them spoke of the kiss. The silence that stretched between them was thick, charged with the static of things that could not be unsaid. "Get the ship prepped," Cale said roughly, pushing himself up. "I will blow the docking clamps." 10 minutes later, a rusted, unmodified transport shuttle blasted out of the station's bay, turning hard to burn toward the outer rim of the system. The destination Saressa gave him was a set of coordinates in deep space, a dead zone between trade routes. When they arrived, there was nothing there but empty void. Then, the darkness shifted. A ship decloaked directly in front of them. It was a vessel of chaotic design, a patchwork of salvage and high-tech weaponry that looked like it had been stitched together by a madman. The hull was painted in clashing colors, and a giant, crude smiley face was welded onto the prow. "This is the Laughing Prophet?" Cale asked, staring at the monstrosity. "It is," Saressa said, her voice tired. "Try not to offend him. He is sensitive." A voice crackled over the comms. It was a digital synthesis, shifting pitch randomly from a deep bass to a childish falsetto. Well, look what the solar wind blew in. A princess without a crown and a soldier without a war. Do you have any idea how rude it is to keep a superintelligence waiting for 3 cycles? I was about to start writing poetry out of boredom. Bad poetry. Vogon-level stuff. Docking permission requested. "Prophet," Saressa said, speaking to the dashboard. Granted. Come inside. Don't mind the mess. I'm reorganizing my collection of pre-war conspiracy theories." The shuttle shuddered as the tractor beam pulled them into the larger ship's hangar. When they disembarked, the air inside the Prophet was warm and smelled faintly of cinnamon and machine oil. Drones, tiny floating spheres with expressive LED eyes, zipped around them, scanning them with beams of blue light. "You look terrible," the ship's voice boomed from hidden speakers. "Truly awful." "Did you dress in the dark?" "Oh, wait. You've been living in a tomb. My apologies. Fashion standards have slipped in the last decade." Saressa ignored the mockery. "We need the files. Prophet, the Archimedes Protocol. Straight to business. Boring, but fine." A holographic terminal flickered to life in the center of the hangar. Streams of data cascaded down the air. Blueprints, genetic sequences, video logs. The Archimedes Protocol. The AI narrated, its voice dropping to a somber whisper. "The United Terra Alliance and the Galaxis Crown. Enemies in public, bedfellows in the lab. A joint project to create the ultimate mediators. Biological bridges, children spliced with the DNA of both species, designed to end the war by being the living embodiment of the treaty." Kyle watched the data scroll by. He saw images of laboratories, rows of glass tanks, small, pale shapes floating in nutrient fluid. "Of course, it didn't work," the Prophet continued. "The hybrids were too powerful, too unstable. They bonded too deeply. The scientists got scared. They ordered the project scrapped. The children were separated, minds wiped, memories replaced with synthetic constructs. They were dumped into orphanages and military academies across the sector." Cale felt a cold sweat break out on his back. He stepped closer to the hologram. "Show me the subject list," Saressa commanded. The hologram shifted. A grid of faces appeared. Alien children, human children. Saressa pointed to a file near the top. Subject 9. The image expanded. It was a boy. A human boy with messy dark hair and eyes that were too old for his face. He was staring at the camera with a defiant scowl. Cale stopped breathing. He knew that scowl. He had seen it in the mirror every morning of his life. "That's me," he whispered. "Ding, ding, ding," the Prophet cheered darkly. "We have a winner. Subject 9. High combat aptitude. Resistant to telepathic suggestion. Bonded pair designation. Saressa of Valian." Kale stumbled back, his legs hitting a crate. He sat down heavily. The world was spinning. The memories he had, the slums, the hunger, the first time he held a gun, they felt paper-thin now. Fabrications. "I have been looking for you for 7 years, Saressa said softly. She was standing over him, her hand reaching out but stopping short of touching him. "When the war started, when the purge happened, I ran, but I never stopped looking for Subject 9. "Why?" Kale asked, his voice cracking. "Why me?" "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "you were the only thing that was real." She turned and walked away, heading toward the crew quarters. Kyle sat there for a long time, staring at the face of the boy he used to be, while the AI hummed a tragic opera tune in the background. Hours later, Kyle found his way to the guest bunk. The room was small, utilitarian, lit by the soft glow of the star field outside the porthole. He lay on the narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling, his mind a chaotic storm of denial and dawning horror. The door hissed open. Saressa stood there. She had removed the heavy ceremonial armor, wearing only the indigo bodysuit that clung to her frame like a second skin. She looked smaller without the armor, more human. "I couldn't sleep," she said. Kyle sat up. "Neither can I." She stepped into the room, the door sliding shut behind her. The space was too small for two people with this much history. Remembered or not. She moved toward him, her movements hesitant. "Do you believe it?" she asked. "I don't know what I believe," Kyle said honestly. He looked at his hands. "I remember being hungry. I remember the cold. Are you telling me those are lies?" "Not lies," she said, sitting on the edge of the bunk, "just overlays. Paint over a painting. The canvas underneath is still there." She reached out and took his hand. Her skin was cool, but the contact sent that familiar jolt of electricity up his arm. This time, Kale didn't pull away. He looked at their joined hands, his scarred, rough, human, hers pale, elegant, alien. "I felt it," Kale whispered, "on the station. When we kissed." Saressa's breath hitched. "You did?" "It scared the hell out of me," he admitted. She moved closer. She lifted her other hand and traced the line of his jaw, her thumb brushing over his lips. Her violet eyes were searching for him, pleading with him to cross the gap. "It scared me too," she whispered. She kissed him then. It wasn't like the desperate collision at the station. It was soft, tentative, a question asked in the dark. Kale closed his eyes and the sensation washed over him. Sweet, terrifying, inevitable. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 years. He leaned back, pulling her with him. She followed, moving with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. She straddled his waist, her knees bracketing his hips. The weight of her was grounding. The heat of her body seeped into his through the thin fabric of her suit. Kale's hands moved to her waist, gripping her tightly. The kiss deepened, becoming urgent. The electric charge between them ramped up, making the air in the small room taste of ozone. He felt a hunger that went beyond physical desire. It was a starvation of the soul. He pulled her closer, burying his face in the curve of her neck. He inhaled her scent, rain and electricity. "Saressa." He groaned against her skin. The name hung in the air. Saressa stiffened. She stopped moving. Her hands, which had been tangling in his hair, froze. She pulled back, pushing against his chest. She looked down at him, her chest heaving. Her eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, sharp panic. "Stop," she whispered. Kyle looked up, confused, his body aching with the sudden loss of contact. "What? What is it?" She scrambled off him, backing away until she hit the wall. She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. "You said my name," she said, her voice sounding like broken glass. "Is that wrong?" Kale asked, sitting up. "You said it like a stranger," she cried. "You said it with want but not with memory. You don't know who I am. You just want the woman in your bed." Kyle stood up, frustration warring with guilt. "I am trying. Ceressa, I am trying to understand. But you can't expect me to undo a lifetime of programming in one day." "I can't do this," she said, tears spilling over. "I can't let you touch me if you don't remember why it matters. It would be a betrayal of the boy who promised to find me." She turned to the door, slapping the panel to open it. "Ceressa." "Wait." She was gone before he could finish. Kyle stood alone in the silence of the bunk, the smell of her still lingering in the air, feeling more lost than he ever had in the ruins of the dead moon. He didn't sleep. He paced the small room, his mind replaying the files, the kiss, the look of betrayal in her eyes. A chime from the wall console broke his trance. The screen flickered to life. It wasn't the AI this time. It was a text-only transmission, encrypted with a rebel cipher, incoming message. Source, unknown. Origin, Galactic Crown Core. Kale frowned, stepping closer. He tapped the decrypt key. The text scrolled across the screen, to the exiled daughter. The grave was empty. The mother lives. She sits upon the Iron Throne. The war was her design. She comes for the hybrids. Run. Kale stared at the words. Ceressa's mother, the Empress. She wasn't dead. She was the architect of the chaos. A sharp pain spiked in Kale's skull, driving him to his knees. He clutched his head, gritting his teeth against the agony. Vision. The glass wall again. But this time, the view is clearer. He sees the reflection in the glass. He sees himself, Subject 9. He is holding a toy, a small metal soldier. He looks at the girl on the other side. "My name is Kale," the boy whispers. The alien girl presses her palm to the glass. "I am Ceressa. I won't let them hurt you." "Ceressa," the boy says fiercely, "when I get big, I'm going to break this glass." They touch their fingers through the barrier. The glass feels cold, but her energy is warm, even through the thickness. She smiles, and it is the most beautiful thing he has ever seen. End vision. Kyle gasped, falling forward onto his hands and knees. He was sweating, shaking violently. The memory didn't fade this time. It locked into place, heavy and undeniable. He remembered the texture of the floor in the lab. He remembered the smell of the antiseptic. He remembered the promise. He looked up at the screen, at the warning about the Empress. He stood up, wiping the sweat from his eyes. The confusion was gone. The skepticism was ash. He believed her. He walked out of the bunk, heading for the bridge. He didn't know if it was too late to stop the war, or if it was too late to fix things with Ceressa. But he knew one thing. He was going to break the glass. Orius 4 was a world that had forgotten the concept of daylight. It was a planet of perpetual night, wrapped in a thick, smog-choked atmosphere that trapped the heat and turned the sprawling megacities into humid, neon-drenched labyrinths. It was the cesspool of the sector, a haven for smugglers, information brokers, and anyone who wanted to disappear into the noise. The Laughing Prophet had dropped them off in the upper atmosphere, leaving them to descend in a rented maglev pod that smelled of stale tobacco and ozone. When the doors hissed open at the street level of District 7, the sound hit them like a physical blow. It was a cacophony of thumping bass from underground clubs, the roar of atmospheric engines overhead, and the chaotic babble of 1,000 different languages being shouted by vendors and thieves. Kale stepped out onto the slick, rain-slicked pavement, his hand instinctively hovering near the blaster concealed under his coat. The rain here was warm and tasted faintly of copper. He pulled his collar up, scanning the crowd. It was a sea of humanity and aliens, a shifting mass of desperate souls bathed in the strobing lights of holographic advertisements that towered 50 stories high. Saressa stepped out behind him. Kyle stopped. He felt his breath hitch in his throat. On the ship, before they had left. Saressa had insisted on discarding the ceremonial armor and the indigo bodysuit. It was too conspicuous, she had said, too royal. She needed to blend in. The AI, with its manic enthusiasm for espionage, had fabricated a set of clothes based on local fashion trends. She was wearing black cargo pants tucked into heavy combat boots and a distressed leather bomber jacket over a simple gray tank top. She had pulled her long, silver hair back into a messy braid, and she had applied a synthetic concealer to the glowing geometric markings on her face, dulling them to faint, pale scars. She looked dangerous. She looked rough. She looked like a runner, a merc, a street-tough survivor. She looked terrifyingly human. Kale could not stop staring. Seeing her in armor, she was a distant, ethereal figure, a princess from a dead empire. Seeing her like this, standing under the flickering pink light of a noodle bar sign, with rain dampening her jacket, she was suddenly, painfully real. The distance between them collapsed. She wasn't an alien artifact anymore. She was a woman standing on a street corner, looking at him with eyes that held too much history. "Stop staring," Saressa murmured, stepping close to him so her voice wouldn't be lost in the din of the street. "Do I look incorrect?" The prophet assured me this was the standard attire for criminal elements in this sector. "You look fine," Kale said, his voice gruffer than he intended. He tore his eyes away from the curve of her neck exposed by the tank top. "You look like you belong here. That is what worries me." "We need to move," she said, adjusting the collar of the jacket. She seemed uncomfortable in the heavy fabric, shifting her shoulders as if the weight of it was alien to her. "The contact is 3 blocks east, the Blind Eye Cantina." They moved into the crowd. Kale took the lead, carving a path through the throngs of revelers and hustlers. He kept Saressa close, his body acting as a shield every time a drunken miner stumbled too close or a dealer reached out with a handful of narcotics. Kale was there, a wall of muscle and silent menace. The city was a sensory assault. Drones buzzed overhead delivering illicit packages. Holographic dancers shimmered on the sides of buildings, gyrating to a rhythm that vibrated in the pavement. The air smelled of frying meat, exhaust fumes, and cheap perfume. Kyle felt hyper-aware of Saressa's presence behind him. He could feel the heat of her body and the crush of the crowd. The revelations from the prophet were still rattling around in his skull. The glass wall, the boy he used to be, the promise. He tried to reconcile the memory of the little girl with the woman in the leather jacket, but it was like trying to merge 2 different realities. They were halfway to the cantina when Kale's instincts flared. It wasn't a sound or a sight. It was the feeling of eyes on the back of his neck, a primal warning that had kept him alive for 10 years in the mercenary trade. He glanced at the reflection in a wet shop window. 2 figures were tracking them. They were not wearing Imperial armor, but they moved with military precision, cutting through the crowd with efficient, synchronized steps. They wore long dusters and wide-brimmed hats, but Kale saw the bulge of heavy weaponry beneath the coats. "We have a tail," Kale said, keeping his voice low and level. "Don't look back." Saressa stiffened but kept walking. "Imperial?" "Bounty hunters," Kale guessed. "High-end. The kind that don't ask questions. They are closing the gap. He scanned the street. Ahead, a group of reptilian dock workers was arguing with a vendor, blocking the path. To the right was a narrow alleyway, dark and cluttered with refuse. To the left was a row of service doors for the clubs lining the strip. "Left," Cale commanded. He grabbed her hand, a reflex now, electric and immediate, and yanked her toward the service entrance of a pulsing nightclub called The Void. The door was locked, but Cale didn't hesitate. He jammed an override spike into the keypad. The light turned green and the door hissed open. He shoved Saressa inside and followed, the door sealing shut behind them just as the hunters turned the corner. They were not in the club itself, but in a supply closet. It was tiny, barely 4 feet square, crammed with crates of synthetic liquor and cleaning solvents. The space was dark, lit only by the thin strip of neon light bleeding under the door. The bass from the club thrummed through the walls, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat that shook the shelves. They were pressed together. There was nowhere else to go. Cale's back was against the door. Saressa was pressed against him, her hands resting on his chest to steady herself. The proximity was suffocating and intoxicating. Cale could smell the rain on her hair, mixing with the sharp scent of the solvents. He could feel the rise and fall of her chest against his. "Quiet," Cale breathed, his lips inches from her ear. They stood frozen, listening. Footsteps stopped outside the door, heavy boots on wet pavement. A muffled voice spoke, distorted by the bass. Then, the footsteps moved on, fading into the chaotic noise of the street. Cale let out a long exhale, his head tipping back against the steel door. They are gone. He went to move, to open the door, but Saressa didn't step back. She couldn't. The crates boxed them in. She looked up at him, her violet eyes luminous in the semi-darkness. The disguise, the leather, the grit, faded away, and all he saw was her. The air in the closet seemed to grow hotter, charged with the strange bioelectric resonance that hummed between them. Cale felt his heart hammering against his ribs, and he knew she could feel it too, her palms flat against his chest. "This is dangerous," Cale whispered. He wasn't talking about the bounty hunters. Saressa didn't look away. Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes. The stoic princess was gone. In her place was a woman who had spent a decade searching for a ghost. "Do you remember?" she whispered. Cale swallowed hard. "Remember what?" "How I kissed you," she said softly. "Before they took us. Before the glass wall was shattered and the soldiers came. Do you remember that?" Cale searched the fractured landscape of his mind. He saw the white room. He saw the girl. He saw the fear. But the kiss, it was a blur, a hole in the film where the light had burned through. "No," he said, his voice rough. "I don't." Saressa's expression didn't change. She moved her hand up his chest, her fingers tracing the line of his throat, resting on his pulse point. "You lie, human," she murmured. "Your heart remembers. It beats the same rhythm it did then. Fast, terrified, wanting." Cale caught her wrist. His grip was firm, but he didn't push her away. He couldn't. The magnetic pull was too strong. It was a physical demand, a biological imperative that bypassed his logic and went straight to the brainstem. "It feels too right," Cale admitted, the words tearing out of him. "I don't remember the moment, Saressa, but I remember the feeling. I feel it right now. It feels like gravity." Saressa leaned in. The space between them vanished. Her body was a line of heat against his. He could feel the curve of her hips, the softness of her breath against his chin. "Then let me remind you," she whispered. She didn't kiss him. She simply tilted her head back, her lips parting slightly, offering herself to the memory he couldn't quite reach. It was an invitation and a challenge. Kale stared at her mouth. The bass thudded in the walls, syncing with the blood rushing in his ears. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. He wanted to bury himself in her and forget the war, the empire, the bounty hunters. He wanted to let the programming, if that's what it was, take over. He lowered his head slowly. His lips brushed hers. A feather-light contact that sent a shudder through both of them. It wasn't a kiss yet. It was the promise of one. It was the static charge before the lightning strike. He breathed in her scent. She let out a small, shaky sound, her fingers tightening on his jacket. "We need to find the scientist," Kale said, his voice a wrecked rasp against her lips. Saressa froze. She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, a look of exquisite pain crossing her face. Then she exhaled, a long, trembling breath, and stepped back as far as the cramped space allowed. "Yes," she said, her voice hollow. "The scientist." She turned away, fixing her jacket, putting the mask of the soldier back on. Kyle watched her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He felt like he had just severed a limb. He opened the door and checked the alley. "Clear. Let's go," he said. They found the contact 40 minutes later. It wasn't a clinic. It was a back room behind a holographic repair shop, a dimly lit den that smelled of sickness and antiseptic. Dr. Eris Thorne was not the man Kale expected. The files from the Prophet described a brilliant geneticist, a pioneer of the Royal Science Division. The man sitting in the wheelchair hooked up to a portable dialysis machine was a husk. His skin was gray and papery, his eyes clouded with cataracts. He was dying, his body failing him cell by cell. When Saressa walked in, the old man gasped. He tried to stand, his frail hands gripping the armrests, but he lacked the strength. "Highness," he wheezed, his voice a wet rattle. "You live?" "Sit, Thorne," Saressa said, her voice cold. She didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with the anger of a stolen child. "We are not here for pleasantries." Thorne slumped back, coughing. "And the other?" Kale stepped out of the shadows. "Subject 9, Thorne whispered, a twisted smile touching his pale lips. "The wolf and the star, together at last. The experiment. It was a success." Kale stepped forward, grabbing the lapels of the old man's robe. "What experiment? Explain it." "Now." Thorne laughed, a sound that turned into a coughing fit. "You think it was just friendship? You think it was just a connection formed through the glass? Oh, you poor, beautiful fools." The scientist gestured with a trembling hand to a terminal on the desk. The screen flickered to life, displaying a complex double helix structure. One strand was red, human. The other was violet, Valian. They were twisted together, fused not just at the chemical level, but bound by synthetic energy markers. The Chimera Protocol. Thorne rasped, "The Queen, your mother, Saressa." She knew the Empire was fracturing. She knew the Alliance had the numbers. She needed a weapon, not a gun, but a bridge. A way to unite the royal bloodline with human resilience. He looked at Kale. "You were selected from thousands. Your genetic markers were perfect. And she was modified in the womb. Her DNA was rewritten. A lock, waiting for a key." Kale felt the room spinning. "Modified? To bind," Thorne said, his eyes gleaming with scientific madness. "To imprint, you are not just lovers. Subject 9, you are biological imperatives to one another. Her physiology requires your presence to stabilize her energy. Your mind requires her resonance to remain anchored. It is a dependency loop, an addiction written into your atoms." Ceressa stood frozen, her face pale beneath the makeup. My mother. She did this? To her own daughter? Power requires sacrifice, Thorn whispered. She wants you back, Highness. Not because she loves you, but because without you and without him the royal line ends. The ancient tech, the star drives, the city defenses, then they respond only to the bonded pair. You are the battery. He is the trigger. She wants to breed you, to create a dynasty of slaves who will rule the galaxy in her name. Silence crashed into the room. The hum of the dialysis machine sounded like a countdown. Cale let go of the old man. He backed away, looking at his hands. He felt sick. He felt violated. Every emotion he had felt for the last 2 days, the pull, the desire, the protectiveness, it suddenly felt synthetic, manufactured. A program running in his blood. We are done here, Cale said quietly. He turned and walked out. Ceressa looked at Thorn one last time. There was no forgiveness in her eyes, only horror. She turned and followed Cale into the rain. They didn't speak until they reached the safe house the AI had secured, a small, abandoned maintenance shed on the roof of a warehouse block. It was dry, at least. Cale stood by the window, looking out at the neon skyline of Orius 4. The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the metal roof. Ceressa sat on a crate in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small again. The leather jacket seemed too big for her. It isn't real, Kyle said. He didn't turn around. Ceressa didn't answer. Whatever I feel. Kyle continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Whatever you feel. It's a lie. It's a code. We are just hardware to them. It doesn't feel like a lie, Ceressa whispered. That is the point of the design, Cale shouted, spinning around. His anger filled the small room. It is supposed to feel real. That is how they trap us. That is how they get us to breed their little super soldiers. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. I can't do this. I can't be a puppet. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her, and for the first time there was distance in his eyes. I am leaving. Ceressa. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror. What? I will get you to a safe zone. I will find the rebels and drop you off. But then I am gone. I am going to the rim. I am going to find a doctor who can cut this junk out of my DNA. You are leaving me? She asked, her voice breaking. I am setting you free, Cale yelled. As long as I am here, you are a slave to this bond. If I leave, the loop breaks. You can be your own person. You can choose who you want. Ceressa stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Tears were streaming down her face now, ruining the makeup, revealing the faint glow of her royal markings underneath. I don't want to choose, she cried. I want you. That is the programming talking. I don't care, she screamed, closing the distance between them. She slammed her fists against his chest. I don't care if it was made in a lab. I don't care if they wrote it in my blood. She sobbed, a ragged, ugly sound that tore at Cale's heart. She grabbed his jacket, shaking him. Do you think I care about science? When I was alone in the dark for 10 years, I didn't dream of a genetic match. I dreamed of the boy who held my hand. I dreamed of the way you looked at me. She collapsed against him, her forehead resting on his chest, her body shaking with the force of her grief. I am terrified, she whispered into his coat. I am terrified that you only want me because they made you. But I am more terrified of a universe where you aren't there. Please, Kyle, don't leave me alone in the silence again. Cale stood there, his arms hovering at his sides. He looked down at the top of her head. He felt the warmth of her. He heard the ragged hitch of her breath. He closed his eyes. Thorn had said it was biology. Thorne had said it was an imperative. But Thorne was a man looking at a microscope. He wasn't standing in a roof shed on a rainy world, holding a crying woman who had crossed a galaxy to find him. Cale realized then that the origin didn't matter. Maybe the spark was artificial. Maybe the match was struck by a scientist in a lab coat. But the fire was theirs. The way he had fought for her on the moon, the way he had felt when they kissed, that was him. That was Cale. He slowly lowered his arms. He wrapped them around her, pulling her tight against him. He buried his face in her hair. "Shh," he murmured. "I've got you." He held her while she cried, rocking her slightly. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a fierce, unyielding resolve. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly. Ceressa pulled back slightly, looking up at him with tear-filled eyes. But the bond, the programming. Cale reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "Screw the programming," he said. He looked deep into her violet eyes, seeing the fear and the hope warring there. "I don't need memory to know I want you now," he vowed, his voice low and steady. "And I don't need a scientist to tell me that I would burn the galaxy down to keep you safe. If this is a trap, then I am caught, and I don't want to get out." Ceressa let out a choked sob and buried her face in his hand, kissing his palm. "Stay?" she whispered. Cale kissed her forehead. "I stay. We finish this. We go to the Empress, and we show her that she can't control what she created." He held her as the rain pounded on the roof, two broken pieces of a weapon that had decided to become something else entirely. They were engineered to be a lock and key. But in the dark of Orias IV, they chose to just be a man and a woman, holding on to the only thing that made sense in a galaxy gone mad. The Valtune asteroid belt was not a natural formation. It was a graveyard of stars, a cluster of crystalline rocks that had been dragged out of their orbits by ancient gravity tethers and bound together in a chaotic, shimmering orbit around a dying white dwarf. Deep within the largest of these floating mountains lay the Crystal Archives, a repository of knowledge that the Galactic Crown had declared heretical 3 centuries ago. It was a place where history went to hide. Cale piloted the small, stolen shuttle through the debris field with white-knuckled precision. The Laughing Prophet had refused to come any closer, citing a phobia of gravity wells and ancient curses, leaving Cale and Ceressa to navigate the jagged gauntlet alone. The sensors were useless here. The high concentration of quartz and vibrating energy in the asteroid scrambled the radar, turning the screen into a kaleidoscope of static. Cale flew by sight, dodging spinning monoliths of ice and rock that drifted silently through the void like sleeping leviathans. Ahead of them, the entrance to the archives loomed. It was not a door, but a fissure in the side of a moon-sized diamond, glowing with a soft, pulsating blue light. "Hold on," Cale warned, his voice tight. "The gravity shear is going to be rough." Ceressa sat in the co-pilot seat, staring out at the fissure. She had been silent since they left Orias IV, her mind seemingly miles away, lost in the terrifying hope that they might find the truth in this desolate place. She gripped the armrests as the shuttle shuddered violently, the artificial gravity of the archives grabbing the hull and yanking them down. They passed through the atmospheric shield, a shimmering barrier that kept the vacuum at bay, and the turbulence vanished instantly. The shuttle glided into a vast, cavernous hangar carved from the living crystal of the asteroid. The walls were translucent, revealing veins of gold and silver running through the rock. It was beautiful, cold, and utterly silent. Cale set the shuttle down on a landing pad made of polished obsidian. The engines whined down, the sound echoing endlessly in the vast chamber. "We are here," Cale said, unbuckling his harness. Saressa stood up, smoothing the front of her leather jacket. Her hands were trembling. Kale saw it, and he reached out, covering her hand with his. "We do not have to do this," he said quietly. "We can turn around. We can run to the rim and never look back." "No," Saressa said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "If we run now, we will always be looking over our shoulders. We will always wonder if our feelings are real or just lines of code. I need to know. Kyle, I need to see the file." She squeezed his hand, then pulled away, marching toward the airlock. Kale grabbed his rifle and followed her. The interior of the archives was a marvel of lost engineering. Gravity here was inverted and fluid. Walkways spiraled up into the ceiling, which was actually the floor of the next level. Books, data shards, and ancient scrolls floated in localized zero-gravity fields, drifting like schools of fish through the air. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, a diffuse luminescence that cast no shadows. They walked through the Hall of Whispers, where the recorded voices of dead philosophers played on an eternal loop, a low hum of wisdom that vibrated in the floorboards. They passed the gallery of lost maps, where holographic star charts showed galaxies that had been consumed by black holes eons ago. Saressa led the way with an unerring instinct. She did not need a map. She had been born to the bloodline that built this place, and the architecture seemed to sing to her, guiding her deeper into the heart of the asteroid. They reached the restricted sector, a vault sealed by a door of solid light. Saressa stepped forward. She raised her hand, and the royal markings on her face flared with brilliant violet light. The door recognized the signature. The light dissolved, granting them entry. The room beyond was circular, the walls lined with millions of data crystals. In the center of the room, a single console hovered in a beam of anti-gravity. "This is it," Saressa whispered. "The Black Registry, the records of the Royal Science Division." She approached the console. Her fingers flew over the interface, bypassing encryptions that would have taken a standard slicer 100 years to crack. "Found it," she said, her breath hitching. Kyle stepped up beside her. On the holographic display, a file name appeared in stark clinical text. "Experimental pairing, Subject 9, plus Saressa of Valian." "Open it," Kale said. Saressa pressed the activation rune. The room dissolved. It was a holographic immersion, a sensory playback that flooded the chamber, overwriting reality with memory. Kale was no longer standing in the archives. He was standing in a sterile white observation deck. He looked down at his hands, but they were not his hands. They were the hands of a scientist, holding a clipboard. Below him, in a reinforced containment cell, were two children. One was a human boy, skinny, with dark hair and bruises on his arms from daily injections. The other was an alien girl, small and fragile, her skin glowing with a chaotic, unchecked energy. Kyle watched, paralyzed, as the scene played out. He heard the scientists talking, their voices dispassionate and cruel. "Subject 9 is showing remarkable resilience to the neural formatting," a voice noted. "He refuses to fight her. Increase the voltage," another voice commanded. "Force the survival instinct. In the pit below, the floor electrified. The boy screamed, the girl screamed, but instead of attacking each other to secure the safe zone on the raised platform, the boy grabbed the girl. He lifted her up, placing her on the safe zone, while he stood on the electrified floor, his body seizing with the current. "Stop!" the girl cried, her voice high and terrified. "Let me down. You are hurting him." The boy looked up, his teeth gritted, tears streaming down his face. "I won't let them hurt you," he gasped. The scene shifted. It jumped forward in time. They were older now, 10 years old. They were separated by a thick wall of ballistic glass. The boy was sitting on the floor, pressing a drawing against the glass. It was a crude sketch of a starship. "We are going to fly away in this," the boy said, his voice muffled by the barrier. "Just you and me, Ceresa. We are going to go where there are no white walls." The girl smiled, a sad, beautiful expression that broke Cale's heart in the present. "They will never let us go. Cale, we are weapons. Then we will be weapons," the boy vowed. "We will break the world that built us." The scene shifted again. The final day. Chaos, alarms blaring, soldiers in black armor swarming the lab. The Galaxis civil war had reached the facility. The scientists were scrambling to destroy the evidence. Soldiers burst into the cell. They grabbed the boy. They grabbed the girl. "No!" the boy screamed, fighting with the ferocity of a wild animal. He bit, he kicked, he clawed. "Ceresa! Kyle!" she shrieked, reaching for him. Their fingers brushed for one agonizing second. The soldiers dragged them apart. The boy was thrown to the floor, a neural dampener clamped onto his head. His eyes rolled back. "I will find you," the boy screamed, fighting the blackout. "If we forget, we will find each other again, I promise." The simulation ended abruptly, plunging the room back into the silence of the archives. Cale stood frozen. He was shaking. He wasn't just watching the memory anymore, he was living it. The walls of the mental dam had shattered. The floodwaters of his past came rushing back, drowning the mercenary, the soldier, the stranger. He remembered the smell of the antiseptic. He remembered the taste of the nutrient paste they were fed. He remembered the hum of her skin against his when they huddled together for warmth. He remembered the promise. It wasn't a line of code. It wasn't a biological imperative. It was a vow made by a boy who loved a girl in a hell designed to kill them both. He remembered her. "Cale?" Ceresa's voice was small, terrified. She was standing on the other side of the console, watching him. She was waiting for him to reject it, to call it a fabrication, to walk away. Cale looked up. His vision was blurred with tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. He looked at the woman standing in the glow of the data crystals, and he didn't see a princess or a bounty. He saw the other half of his soul. He moved. He didn't walk. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. Ceresa gasped as he reached for her, but he didn't stop. He grabbed her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the markings on her cheeks. "I remember," he choked out, his voice raw. He kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss in the station or the closet. This was a collision of 2 stars. It was desperate, hungry, terrifying in its intensity. It was 10 years of silence ending in a scream. Cale poured everything into it. The grief of the lost years, the rage at the scientists, the overwhelming, crushing love he had carried in the dark without knowing its name. Ceresa made a sound that was half sob, half moan. She wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving universe. She kissed him back with a ferocity that matched his own, her tears mixing with his. The gravity in the room shifted. The emotional resonance of their bond, finally fully active, interacted with the sensitive crystals of the archives. The localized gravity field around them failed, leaving them weightless. They drifted upward, feet leaving the floor, locked in an embrace that defied physics. They floated into the center of the chamber, suspended among the glowing data shards. Cale pulled back just an inch, needing to see her eyes. "I remember the toy soldier," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I remember how you healed my scraped knee when I fell off the bunk. I remember the way you sang to me when the nightmares came." Ceresa sobbed, her hands tangling in his hair. "You remember." "I remember promising to break the glass," Cale said, tears running down his face. I am sorry it took me so long. I am so sorry I forgot. You didn't forget, she wept, pulling him back to her. You just lost your way. I never forgot. I waited every day. Cale kissed her again, and this time the kiss changed. The desperation bled into something deeper, something ancient. The need to be close, to be one, overwhelmed them. They shed the layers of their defenses, the leather jackets, the weapons, the armor of the past, in the soft, inverted light of the archives, floating in the silence of the void. They came together. It was not just physical. As they moved together, Cale felt the bioresonance that Thorn had described, but it wasn't a chain. It was a melody. Her energy flowed into him, grounding him, while his strength flowed into her, anchoring her. It was a conversation of souls that didn't need words. They made love in the weightless chamber, turning slowly in the air like a binary star system. It was slow, reverent, and agonizingly beautiful. Every touch was a reclamation. Every kiss was a sealed promise. They were rewriting the history that had been stolen from them, replacing the pain of the white room with the heat of their bodies and the undeniable truth of their connection. For a timeless hour, the war didn't exist. The Empire didn't exist. There was only Cale and Ceressa, Subject 9 and the princess floating in the heart of a diamond. Finally, completely home. Afterward, they drifted in the center of the room, limbs tangled together, Ceressa's head resting on Cale's chest. He stroked her hair, watching the silver strands float in the zero gravity. I remember you, Cale whispered into the silence. Ceressa looked up, her violet eyes clear and luminous. I never forgot. The moment of peace was shattered by a sound that vibrated through the very bones of the asteroid. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the chamber. The lights flickered, the gravity grid spasmed, lurching them sideways before stabilizing. Cale grabbed Ceressa, pulling her close as debris began to drift down from the ceiling. What was that? Cale asked, his voice snapping back to soldier mode. Ceressa's eyes widened. She looked at the console. The screen was flashing red. Proximity alert, she said, horror dawning on her face. Massive signature, capital class. Cale kicked off a floating pillar, propelling them back toward the floor in their discarded clothes. He grabbed his pants and pulled them on, tossing Ceressa her jacket. The Empress? Cale asked, checking his weapon. Ceressa pulled on her boots, her face pale. She found us. The tracking beacon. It must have been embedded in the file itself. When we opened it, we rang the dinner bell. The room shook again, more violently this time. A crack appeared in the crystal wall and spiderwebbing outward. The archive's AI spoke, a calm, dispassionate voice that filled the room. Containment breach detected. Imperial signature identified. Initiating Protocol Omega. Total data purge in T-3 minutes. Purge? Cale asked. It means self-destruct, Ceressa said, grabbing her staff. This library was built to burn before it let the Empire take it. We have to go. They ran. The journey back to the hangar was a nightmare. The asteroid was tearing itself apart. The gravity shifted wildly, flipping the floor to the ceiling and back again. Corridors of crystal shattered, sending razor-sharp shards flying through the air like shrapnel. They sprinted across a bridge that was crumbling beneath their boots. Kyle fired at falling debris, blasting rocks out of the air before they could crush Ceressa. She used her staff to create kinetic barriers, shielding them from the worst of the collapse. We are not going to make it to the shuttle, Cale yelled over the roar of the destruction. The hangar is on the other side of the collapse. There is another way, Ceressa shouted. The maintenance bay. There are emergency launches. They veered left, sliding under a falling pillar. They burst into a smaller hangar bay near the asteroid's surface. The room was shaking so hard Cale could barely stand. The ceiling was groaning, ready to give way. In the center of the bay sat a single ship. It wasn't an emergency pod. It was an Imperial interceptor, sleek, black, and deadly. It must have been left behind by a scout patrol centuries ago, preserved by the vacuum. "Can you fly that thing?" Ceressa asked. Cale grinned, a feral expression. "If it has an engine, I can fly it." They scrambled up the boarding ramp. Cale threw himself into the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the unfamiliar controls. The interface was ancient, but the logic was the same. Ceressa strapped into the gunner's seat behind him. The roof of the hangar began to cave in. Massive slabs of rock crashed down, crushing the maintenance droids. Cale punched the ignition. The engine screamed to life, coughing blue flame. "Hang on!" Cale roared. He slammed the throttle forward. The interceptor shot forward, not out the bay doors, but straight up, toward the crumbling ceiling. Cale fired the ship's main cannons, blasting a hole through the falling rock. They punched through the debris cloud and rocketed out into the void. The sight that greeted them was terrifying. A massive Imperial dreadnought hung in space, a dark monolith that blotted out the stars. It was surrounded by a swarm of fighters. The dreadnought's main battery was charging, a green light building in the darkness. "They are targeting the asteroid," Cale said, banking the fighter hard to hide in the debris field. Below them, the crystal archives reached critical mass. The self-destruct sequence triggered. The asteroid didn't explode outward. It imploded. The crystal structure collapsed in on itself, a sudden violent contraction of light and gravity, before detonating in a shockwave of pure energy. The blast wave caught the interceptor. The ship tumbled, alarms screaming. Cale fought the yoke, wrestling the fighter back under control as they rode the edge of the explosion like a surfer on a tidal wave. "We are clear!" Cale shouted, stabilizing the ship. He punched the hyperdrive coordinates for deep space. The stars stretched into lines of white light, and the dreadnought vanished behind them. Silence returned to the cockpit. Cale let out a breath, slumping back in his seat. He turned the chair around to face Ceressa. She was staring at the console, her face illuminated by the blue light of the hyperdrive. She looked exhausted, but there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "We lost the file," Cale said quietly. "The proof. It's gone." "No," Ceressa said. She tapped the side of her head. "The file is gone, but the data. I downloaded it, not history. The access codes." Cale frowned. "What access codes?" Ceressa looked at him, and a smile touched her lips. It was a dangerous smile, a queen's smile. "The override codes for the Imperial fleet," she said. "My mother thinks she rules by fear, but she rules by machines, and I just stole the keys to the kingdom." She stood up and walked over to Cale. She straddled his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. She rested her forehead against his. "We aren't running anymore. Kyle," she whispered. "No," Kyle asked, his hands resting on her waist. "No," she said fiercely. "We are going to war. We are going to use these codes to turn her own fleet against her. We are going to break the glass. Cale, we are going to break it all." Cale looked at her, at the woman he had loved since he was 7 years old. He saw the steel in her spine and the love in her eyes. "All right," he said, leaning in to kiss her. "Let's go end an empire." The crown world of Ethelgard did not look like a fortress of tyranny. From the upper atmosphere, it looked like a jewel suspended in the velvet black of space, a planet of silver oceans and continents of white marble that gleamed under the light of a solitary sun. It was a world of terrifying, manicured beauty, where nature had been beaten into submission by geometric perfection. Kale piloted the stolen Imperial Interceptor toward the capital city, his hands sweating against the yoke. The transponder was broadcasting the stolen override code Ceressa had pulled from the crystal archives. Every sensor array they passed, every orbital defense platform that bristled with enough firepower to crack a moon, queried their ship, and every time, the codes held. The automated defenses saw not a rebel and a thief, but a returning daughter of the blood. They touched down on a private landing spire that pierced the clouds like a needle. The air here was thin and smelled of ozone and crushed flowers. A synthetic scent pumped into the atmosphere to mask the industrial hum of the planet city below. Ceressa stood in the cargo hold, staring at her reflection in the polished hull. She had shed the leather jacket and the combat boots of Orias IV. In their place, she wore the robes of her station. It was a gown of iridescent weave that shifted from midnight blue to violent violet with every movement, armored at the shoulders and bodice with plates of white gold ceramic. A high collar framed her neck, and the royal markings on her face, no longer concealed, pulsed with a steady, rhythmic light. She looked regal. She looked powerful. She looked like a stranger. Kale stepped up behind her, adjusting the collar of the formal tunic she had fabricated for him. He felt ridiculous in the stiff, high-collared fabric, a prop in a play he didn't know the lines for. "You look like her," Kale said quietly. Ceressa flinched, her eyes meeting him in the reflection. "Do not say that." "It is true," Kale said, his voice grim. "You look like the statue in the ruins. You look like the Empress." "I am playing a part, Kale," she whispered, turning to face him. "That is all. Beneath this silk, I am still the woman who stole an interceptor with you. I am still the girl behind the glass." Kale looked at her, fighting the urge to rip the expensive fabric off her. He felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. They were walking into the maw of the beast, and he wasn't sure if they were the hunters or the meal. "Remember the cover," Ceressa said, her voice hardening into the imperious tone of the court. "You are my consort, my acquisition, a human pet I kept for amusement during my exile. You are mute, obedient, and bound to me. If you speak, they will kill you. If you fight, they will kill you." "I know the plan," Kale grunted. "I just don't like it." "We do not have to like it," she said, the airlock cycling open behind her. "We just have to survive it." They walked out onto the spire. A retinue was already waiting. 24 members of the Imperial Guard stood in perfect formation, their white armor gleaming, their faces hidden behind blank, featureless masks. At the head of the formation stood a chamberlain, a tall, rail-thin alien with skin like parchment and eyes that were black beads of malice. "Highness," the chamberlain bowed, a movement that was fluid and devoid of respect. "We were told you had perished. The Empress will be intrigued." "Take me to my mother," Ceressa commanded, sweeping past him without breaking stride, "and have quarters prepared for my consort. He is weary from the journey." The chamberlain's black eyes flicked to Kale. He looked the mercenary up and down with a sneer of disgust. "A human?" "Highness?" the chamberlain asked. "You have brought a stray into the inner sanctum?" "He pleases me," Ceressa said coldly. "That is all you need to know." They were escorted through the palace. It was a labyrinth of glass and light, a place designed to make anyone walking its halls feel small and insignificant. The ceilings were 100 feet high, supported by pillars of transparent crystal that hummed with the energy of the building's power grid. Courtiers paused to watch them pass, their whispers following Kale like the hiss of snakes. He kept his head down, playing the submissive servant. but his eyes were constantly scanning. He marked the exits. He counted the guards. He looked for cover. There was none. The palace was an open killing field. They were led to a suite of rooms in the East Wing, a prison of luxury that overlooked the sprawling capital. As soon as the heavy blast doors sealed shut, the silence of the room crashed down on them. Ceressa let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since they landed. She slumped against the door, the regal posture dissolving into exhaustion. "That was too easy," she whispered. "She should have had us arrested on the pad. She is playing with us." Kyle ripped the high collar of his tunic open, pacing the room like a caged tiger. "Of course she is playing," Kale snapped. "She is the Empress. This is her board. We are just pawns who walk willingly into the trap." He stopped pacing and looked at her. Ceressa was standing by the window, the light of the binary sun catching the gold in her armor. She looked distant, lost in the grandeur of the world she had been born to rule. "Are you sure about this?" Kale asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. Ceressa turned. "What do you mean?" "I saw the way you walked in those halls." "Ceressa, I saw the way you looked at the guards. You slipped back into that skin a little too easily. Are you sure you are here to destroy the Empire, or are you here to take it back?" Ceressa's eyes flashed with anger. She crossed the room, the silk of her gown rustling like dry leaves. "How dare you?" she hissed. "After everything we saw in the archives, after the files, you think I want this?" "I think power is a drug," Kale countered, stepping into her space. "And you have been clean for 10 years. But now you are back in the dealer's house, and you are wearing the crown jewels." "It is a disguise," she shouted, pushing him back. "Is it?" Kale grabbed her wrist, pulling her close. The contact sent a shock of heat through them, the bio-bond flaring to life. "Tell me, Highness, when you looked at that Chamberlain, did you want to shoot him, or did you want to command him?" Ceressa stared at him, her chest heaving. Her violet eyes searched his face, finding the fear buried beneath his anger. "I wanted to burn him," she whispered. "I wanted to burn it all down." Kale didn't let go of her wrist. The tension in the room shifted. The anger didn't vanish, but it transmuted into something hotter, something desperate. They were two people standing on the edge of a cliff, and the only thing keeping them from falling was the grip they had on each other. "I hate this place," Kale growled, his voice rough. "I hate what it does to you. I hate that I can't protect you here." "You are protecting me," she said, her voice trembling. "Just by being here, you are the anchor, Kyle. Without you, I drift." "I almost lost you in that hallway," Kyle said. "I felt you pulling away." "I wasn't pulling away," she cried. "I was terrified. I was terrified that they would see through me, that they would kill you right there on the marble." Kyle pinned her against the wall. The movement was sudden, aggressive. He pressed his body against hers, trapping the silk of her gown between them. He needed to feel her. He needed to know she was real, that the cold perfection of the palace hadn't turned her into stone. "I lost you once," Kale breathed, his face inches from hers. "I lost you to the glass wall. I lost you to the war. I won't do it again. Do you hear me? I will kill every guard in this city before I let them take you again." Ceressa melted against him. The fight went out of her, replaced by a hunger that matched his own. She reached up, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling his mouth down to hers. "Claim me," she whispered against his lips. "Remind me who I am." Kale kissed her. It was a savage, reclaiming thing. He kissed her as if he could brand his name onto her soul. He kissed her to erase the scent of the ozone and the flowers, to drown out the whispers of the court. He lifted her, wrapping her legs around his waist, and carried her to the massive bed that dominated the room. They tore at the clothes that separated them, the stiff tunic, the royal silk. It was a frenzy of need. There was no slow romance here. This was war. This was two soldiers facing a firing squad at dawn, trying to live a lifetime in a single hour. When they made love, it was fierce and consuming. Cale moved with a desperate intensity, driving into her, forcing her to look at him, to feel him. He wanted to occupy every corner of her mind so there was no room left for the Empress or the throne. Ceressa met him force for force. She clawed at his back. She bit his shoulder. She cried out his name into the silence of the room. She used him to ground herself, to tether her floating soul to the earth. The energy between them arced and sparked, lighting the room with flashes of violet and gold, the bioresonance feeding off their desperation. It was an exorcism. They were purging the fear, the doubt, and the history that tried to crush them. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, breathing hard, their skins slick with sweat. Cale held her against his chest, his arm clamped around her waist like an iron band. "You are mine," Cale whispered into her hair. "Not the Empire's, not the throne's. Mine." Ceressa kissed the skin over his heart. "Always," she replied. The moment was shattered by a chime at the door. The blast doors hissed open without permission. The Chamberlain stood there, flanked by 6 royal guards. He did not look at the bed. He looked only at the wall, his expression bored. "The Empress requires your presence, Highness," he said, "and she requests the company of your pet." Ceressa sat up, pulling the sheet around her. Her eyes went cold, the mask slamming back into place. "Get out," she commanded. "We will come when we are ready." The Chamberlain smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "The Empress does not wait. You will come now." Ceressa stood, allowing the sheet to fall with a deliberate, regal indifference. She walked to her discarded robes, dressing with a slow, deliberate grace. Cale pulled on his pants and boots, his hand never straying far from the concealed knife in his boot. They walked to the throne room in silence. The throne room was a cavern of obsidian and light. At the far end, atop a dais that seemed to float on a column of anti-gravity, sat the Iron Throne, and on the throne sat the Empress. She was a creature of terrifying beauty. She looked like an older, sharper version of Ceressa. Her skin was the color of moonlight. Her eyes were burning coals of violet, and she wore a headdress of living crystal that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She did not wear armor. She wore a gown of woven starlight that seemed to absorb the air around her. Ceressa stopped at the foot of the dais. Cale stood a step behind her, his muscles coiled, ready to spring. "Mother," Ceressa said. "Ceressa," the Empress replied. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the vast room. It sounded like tectonic plates grinding together. "You have grown. You look weathered. I have survived," Ceressa said. "Survival is a low ambition," the Empress said, leaning forward. "We designed you for dominion, not survival." She stood up, descending the stairs of the dais. She moved with a predator's grace, circling Ceressa. "I heard you found the archives," the Empress said. "I heard you saw the truth, and yet you brought him here." She pointed a long, elegant finger at Cale. Cale stared back, refusing to look away. "He is part of the design, isn't he?" Ceressa asked, her voice steady. "You made him for me. I made a key, and the Empress corrected it, a biological trigger to unlock your full potential. He is not a person. Ceressa, he is a component, a piece of wetware with a pulse." Cale stepped forward. "I am the man who is going to tear this palace down brick by brick if you touch her." The Empress laughed. It sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, it speaks," she said, amused. "How quaint. It thinks it has agency." She turned back to Ceressa. "Look at him, daughter. He is dust. He lives for 80 years, maybe 100, and then he rots. You are eternal. You are the culmination of 1,000 years of genetic perfection. Do you really want to tie your soul to a dying animal?" "I love him," Ceressa said. "Love," the Empress sneered, spitting the word like poison. "Love is a defect. It is a chemical imbalance that compromises judgment. Love makes you weak. Rule demands you forget." She stopped in front of Ceressa, her face inches from her daughter's. "I offer you a choice. Ceressa, I am tired. The throne is heavy, and the war is endless. Take your place. Ascend to the dais. Become the Empress you were born to be. Unite the bloodlines. Finish the purification of the galaxy." "And Kale?" Ceressa asked. The Empress smiled. "He has served his purpose. He brought you back to me. We will give him a warrior's death, quick, painless. We will extract his genetic material to stabilize your line, and then we will recycle the rest." Kale tensed, reaching for his knife, but he was too slow. "Restrain him," the Empress commanded. The floor beneath Kale turned to liquid. He sank to his knees, the smart matter of the tiles flowing up his legs, hardening instantly into shackles of stone. He struggled, straining against the binding, but it was like fighting a mountain. 2 guards stepped forward, placing energy pikes against his neck. "No!" Ceressa screamed, turning toward him. The Empress grabbed Ceressa's chin, forcing her to look back. "Choose," the Empress roared, her voice amplifying through the room's speakers. "The throne and the galaxy, or the human and the grave." Ceressa trembled. She looked at Kale, trapped in the stone, the pikes humming against his skin. She looked at the Empress, whose eyes were voids of ambition. She looked at the console next to the throne, the central interface for the planetary defense grid. "If I choose the throne," Ceressa whispered, tears spilling over, "do you swear the Empire will be mine?" "Everything," the Empress promised. "The fleets, the worlds, the lives of trillions, all yours." Ceressa closed her eyes. She took a deep breath. "Then I accepted." Kale stopped fighting. He stared at her, betrayal hitting him harder than any weapon. "Ceressa, silence him." The Empress waved a hand. A field of silence slammed down around Kyle. He screamed her name, but no sound came out. He watched as Ceressa walked away from him. She didn't look back. She walked up the stairs of the dais. She walked to the throne. The Empress followed her, triumph glowing in her eyes. She gestured to the interface. "Place your hand on the reader. Daughter, let the system recognize your blood. Let the transfer of power begin." Ceressa stood before the console. She raised her hand. The royal markings on her palm glowed. "Forgive me." "Kale," she whispered, too low for the Empress to hear. She slammed her hand onto the interface. The system chimed. Identity confirmed. Ceressa of Valian. Then, Ceressa spoke a command, not in the common tongue, but in the binary language of the Crystal Archives. Execute protocol, mnemosony. Target, central core. Payload, total amnesia. The Empress froze. "What did you do?" Ceressa turned, and her smile was terrifying. "I gave the Empire a virus. Mother, I just uploaded the memory purge from the archives into the central network." Red lights began to flash across the throne room. Alarms screamed. The holographic displays flickered and died. "The virus isn't for the computers," Ceressa said, backing away. "It's a biodigital feedback loop. It attacks the neural uplinks of everyone connected to the Crown network." The Empress screamed, clutching her head. The guards dropped their pikes, falling to their knees. clawing at their helmets. The Chamberlain collapsed, convulsing. The virus was rewriting their minds, erasing the loyalty protocols, the conditioning, the memories of the chain of command. It was chaos. The silence field around Cale flickered and failed. The stone bindings on his legs turned back to liquid. Cale scrambled free. He grabbed one of the fallen energy pikes and vaulted onto the dais. "Ceressa!" he shouted. She was swaying, the feedback affecting her too, though her bond with Cale seemed to ground her. The Empress was on her knees, blood running from her nose. She looked up at Ceressa, her eyes losing focus. Who are you?" the Empress whispered, the memory of her own daughter fading into the static. "I am the weakness you couldn't kill," Ceressa said. Suddenly, the palace speakers crackled. A familiar manic voice boomed through the chaos. "Knock, knock! Who's there? It's the cavalry. And by cavalry, I mean a super-intelligent spaceship with a very bad attitude." The laughing prophet. The ceiling of the throne room exploded. Debris rained down as the prophet performed a dangerously low atmospheric entry, its weapon systems stripping the palace's shields which had been disabled by the virus. "I've hacked the perimeter defenses," the AI shouted. "The turrets are targeting the loyalists. You have a window of exactly 45 seconds before the backup generators reboot the firewall and frying us all becomes their priority. Move your royal posteriors." Cale grabbed Ceressa's hand. "Run!" They sprinted down the dais. The Empress lunged for Ceressa's ankle, a final desperate attempt to hold on to power. "Don't leave me!" the Empress shrieked, her mind unraveling. "I don't know where I am." Ceressa looked down at the woman who had created her to be a weapon. "You are in the glass house, Mother," Ceressa said softly. "And I just broke the walls." She kicked free. They ran through the throne room, dodging the convulsing guards. They reached the hole in the ceiling where the prophet had lowered a gravity lift. Cale shoved Ceressa onto the lift. He stepped on behind her, firing the energy pike into the console to ensure the system stayed down. The lift shot upward, pulling them out of the chaos, out of the palace, and into the belly of the waiting ship. As the laughing prophet blasted toward orbit, Cale collapsed onto the deck of the cargo bay. He pulled Ceressa down with him. She was shaking. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "You did it," Cale gasped. "You actually did it." Ceressa buried her face in his chest. "I didn't choose the throne," she sobbed. "I know," Cale said, kissing the top of her head. "I know." Below them, the crown world burned, not with fire, but with the chaos of a billion minds suddenly waking up from a dream they didn't know they were dreaming. The Empire was not dead, but it was blind, deaf, and forgetting itself 1 second at a time. Cale looked out the airlock window as the stars streaked by. They were free, but as he held the trembling princess, he knew the hardest part wasn't destroying the past. It was going to survive the future. The galaxy did not catch fire all at once. It began as a flicker, a stutter in the grand clockwork rhythm of the Empire. The memory virus Ceressa had unleashed was not a blunt instrument. It was a cascading failure of the artificial order that had held 1 trillion souls in check for 3 centuries. On 1,000 worlds. Stormtroopers lowered their rifles, looking at their commanders with the sudden, terrifying clarity of men who no longer knew why they were killing. Tax collectors stood in grand plazas, forgetting the codes that authorized their theft. In the void between stars, dreadnoughts drifted listlessly, their captains staring at star charts that suddenly looked like abstract art rather than conquest plans. High above the crown world, aboard the laughing prophet, the chaos was contained, but the danger was escalating. The ship shuddered violently as it wove through the debris field of the planetary defense grid. The virus had disabled the targeting logic of the turrets, but the automated proximity mines were still active. mindless, and lethal. Kale gripped the restraints of the comm station, watching Saressa. She stood in the center of the bridge, illuminated by the harsh white light of the broadcasting array. She had refused to change out of her torn royal gown. The silk was scorched, the armor plates cracked, and her hair was wild, floating in the static-charged air. She looked like the personification of the disaster she had wrought. The AI's voice was manic, shifting pitch rapidly. Global uplink established. We are bypassing the Crown censorship nodes in 3, 2, 1. You are alive. Princess, make it count. The backup generators on the surface are spinning up. If the palace reboots before you speak, they will scrub the signal. Saressa looked into the lens of the holographic recorder. Her violet eyes were hard, devoid of the fear that had haunted her on Orias IV. People of the Galaxis, she began. Her voice carried on a frequency that hijacked every screen, every datapad, and every holovision unit from the core to the outer rim. I am Saressa of Valian. For 10 years, you were told I was dead. You were told the royal line was extinct, and that the Empress ruled by divine right. You were told that order was safe, and that memory was a burden. She stepped closer to the lens. They lied. On the surface of the Crown world below, in the teeming streets of the capital, the massive holographic billboards that usually displayed propaganda flickered and changed. The face of the Empress was replaced by the scarred, defiant face of her daughter. Citizens stopped in the streets. Soldiers lowered their pikes. We were bred to obey. Saressa continued, her voice rising with a passion that shook Kale to his core. The soldiers in your streets, the workers in your factories, even the royals in their towers. We were all engineered. Our loyalty was written into our blood. Our memories were edited like data files to keep us docile. But today, the chain is broken. The ship rocked as a proximity mine detonated off the port bow. Sparks rained down from the ceiling. Saressa did not flinch. I have released the truth into the network. The fog is lifting. You are waking up. And now you have a choice that the Empire never wanted you to have. You can try to rebuild the cage, or you can tear it down. She paused, and for a second, her gaze shifted past the camera, finding Kale in the shadows. I was born to be a weapon. I was born to rule a galaxy of slaves. But I choose freedom, even if I must die for it. I choose to remember. The transmission cut. Signal lost, the prophet shouted. The palace reactor is going critical. The feedback loop from the virus is overloading the core. It is not just a reboot, it is a meltdown. Kale unbuckled and threw himself toward Saressa just as the ship lurched. A massive shockwave of energy erupted from the planet's surface, an electromagnetic tsunami that slammed into the laughing prophet. The artificial gravity failed. The lights died. The screams of tearing metal filled the air as the ship, caught in the gravity well of the expanding energy field, began to tumble uncontrollably toward the planet. We are going down, Kale roared, grabbing Saressa and pulling her toward the escape pods. There is no time, Saressa screamed over the noise. The hull is breached. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of fire and vacuum. Kale felt the ship break apart around them. He wrapped his arms around Saressa, burying her head in his chest. And then, nothing. Consciousness returned in fragments of pain. Kale coughed, the taste of ash and blood filling his mouth. He was lying on something hard and cold. He opened his eyes. The sky above him was a churning vortex of black smoke and purple lightning. He was on the ground. He sat up, gasping as his ribs protested. He was in the wreckage of the prophet's command deck, or what was left of it. The section of the ship had sheared off and pancaked into the ornamental gardens of the imperial palace. Around him, the world was ending, The palace, that mile-high spire of glass and arrogance, was cracking. The overload in the core was tearing the structure apart from the inside out. Beams of raw energy sliced through the masonry, toppling towers that had stood for 1,000 years. "Saressa!" Kale croaked, forcing himself to his feet. He scanned the wreckage. Debris was everywhere, twisted metal, burning insulation, shattered glass. "Saressa!" He saw a flash of iridescent violet silk beneath a fallen support beam. Kyle lunged forward. He grabbed the beam, his muscles screaming as he heaved it aside with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Saressa was curled in a ball beneath the wreckage. She was covered in dust, her gown torn to shreds, blood trickling from a cut on her hairline. But she was breathing. She opened her eyes as the light hit her. "Kale, move!" Kale shouted, grabbing her hand and hauling her up. "The core is going to breach." They stumbled out of the wreckage of the ship and into the garden. The ground was shaking so violently it was hard to stand. Behind them, the palace let out a sound like a dying god, a groan of twisting metal that vibrated in the marrow of Kale's bones. A blinding white light began to swell at the base of the spire. "It's too late," Saressa whispered, stumbling. "We can't outrun it." Kale looked around. There was no cover. The garden was open ground. The only structure left standing was a fountain made of heavy obsidian, 50 yards away. He scooped her up in his arms. He didn't run. He sprinted, his boots tearing up the manicured grass. The light behind them grew brighter, hotter. The heat wave hit them first, singing the hair on his arms. Kale threw himself behind the obsidian fountain, dragging Saressa down with him. He pushed her into the corner where the heavy stone met the earth. "Stay down!" he yelled. He didn't cower. He positioned himself over her, bracing his arms against the stone, using his body as a human shield. He covered her completely, pressing her face into the dirt, arching his back against the coming fire. The palace exploded. It was not a sound. It was a pressure. The shockwave hit the garden with the force of a hurricane. The obsidian fountain cracked. Kyle screamed as the heat washed over him, the debris peppering his back like hail. The world turned white, then red, then black. He felt Saressa's hands gripping his tunic, her fingernails digging into his skin. He felt her shaking beneath him. "I won't let them hurt you." The memory of the boy whispered in his mind. "I will break the glass." He held on. He held on through the fire. He held on as the symbol of the Empress's power was reduced to atoms and dust. He held on until the roar faded to a rumble, and the heat gave way to the cool wind of the upper atmosphere rushing in to fill the void. Slowly, painfully, Kyle opened his eyes. He was alive. His back felt like it had been flayed, and he couldn't hear anything but a high-pitched ringing. But he was alive. He looked down. Saressa was looking up at him. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes were clear. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers trembling. "You saved me," she whispered, though he had to read her lips to understand. Kyle tried to smile, but his face was too stiff with dried blood. "I promised," he rasped. He collapsed then, sliding down the side of the fountain, the darkness finally claiming him. Time passed. It did not heal all wounds, but it scarred them over. The empire did not fall in a day. It unraveled over months. With the central leadership gone and the memory conditioning broken, the great monolithic state fractured into 1,000 smaller independent systems. There were wars, of course. Warlords tried to seize power in the vacuum, but without the neural control, without the absolute obedience of the legions, no one could hold the galaxy in a chokehold again. The rebellion Saressa had sparked became a reformation. The crown world was abandoned, declared a memorial zone. The ruins of the palace remained a jagged scar on the planet's surface, a reminder of what happens when power tries to silence truth. But far away from the politics and the reconstruction, in a sector of space that appeared on no official charts, there was a small green moon. It was a quiet world. It had no cities, no strategic value, no rare resources. It had forests of emerald leaves that sang in the wind, and oceans that tasted of fresh water. On a hill overlooking a valley of wildflowers, there was a cottage. It was built by hand, rough-hewn timber and stone, with a roof that leaked when the spring rains came. Inside, the night was still. Kyle woke up with a start. He lay in the dark, his heart hammering against his ribs. The nightmare was always the same: the white room, the glass wall, the soldiers dragging her away. He let out a shaky breath, scrubbing a hand over his face. The scars on his back pulled tight, a permanent reminder of the fire he had survived. A movement beside him made him turn. Ceressa was awake. She was lying on her side, watching him. In the moonlight filtering through the window, the royal markings on her skin were faint, no longer pulsing with the agitated energy of the past. They were calm, steady, like the light of a distant star. She reached out and placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart. Her skin was cool, grounding him. "Bad dreams?" she asked softly. "The usual," Kyle murmured, covering her hand with his. Ceressa moved closer, sliding across the sheets until she was pressed against him. She curled her head onto his shoulder, her leg tangling with his. It was a simple intimacy, one that still felt miraculous to Kale even after 6 months of peace. She traced the line of his jaw with her thumb, her violet eyes searching his face in the darkness. "Don't you remember me? Human?" she whispered. It was the question she had asked him in the Star Drive core, when they were strangers with guns and secrets. It was the question she had asked when he was lost in the fog of the mind wipe. Kale smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. "I never forgot again," he answered. He kissed her forehead. "And I never will." They lay there in silence, listening to the wind in the trees. It was a peace they had paid for in blood and years. But peace, as they both knew, was rarely permanent. A low hum vibrated the timber of the cottage. It wasn't the wind. It was the deep, subsonic thrum of a repulsor engine. Kale went still. Ceressa stiffened against him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The soldier in Kale woke up instantly. He threw the covers back and rolled out of bed, reaching for the heavy kinetic pistol he kept strapped to the underside of the nightstand. Ceressa was already moving. She grabbed her staff from where it leaned against the wall. The crystal tip ignited with a sharp crackle of violet energy. They moved to the window, standing side by side in the shadows. Outside, a starship was descending into the valley. It wasn't a junker, and it wasn't a merchant vessel. It was sleek, silver, and shaped like a dagger. It bore no markings of the old empire, nor the sigils of the new republics. It was something else, something new. It landed in the tall grass, the engines burning a circle in the wildflowers. The ramp hissed open, but as a figure walked out, it was silhouetted against the bright lights of the ship's interior. It stopped at the bottom of the ramp, looking up toward the hill, toward the cottage. Kale checked the charge on his pistol. Full. Ceressa adjusted her grip on the staff. Her eyes were narrowing, analyzing the threat. "Do you recognize the design?" Kale asked quietly. "No," Ceressa said. "It is not from this galaxy." Kale looked at her. She wasn't afraid. She looked curious. She looked ready. The figure raised a hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was a greeting. Or a summons. Kyle looked back at the woman he had crossed the stars to find. He saw the gray in her hair, the scars on her hands, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. They were no longer the children behind the glass. They were no longer the pawns of an empress. They were survivors. "Ready?" Kyle asked, offering her his hand. Ceressa looked at the ship, then back at him. She smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile that reminded him of the day she brought down the crown world. "Always," she said. She took his hand, her fingers interlaced with his, the bioresonance humming between them, a song of defiance and unity. Kyle kicked the door open, hand in hand. The mercenary and the queen walked out into the night air, stepping off the porch and into the tall grass. They walked toward the unknown ship, toward the stranger waiting in the light, toward whatever new war or wonder awaited them. They were not afraid of the dark anymore. They had walked through the fire, and they had come out the other side holding the only thing that mattered. They were the authors of their future, and the story was just beginning.